AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers. And today I have an exciting guest. I'm also very pleased to say that I have Fran Moore joining me as co-host, and she will actually do the interview. Fran's spent a career at CIA, serving in a series of senior analytic positions to include Director of Intelligence, Director of Terrorism Analysis, Director of Counterintelligence Analysis, and Chief Learning Officer. She also served in a series of private sector positions and is currently the president of FPM Consulting. She is a member of the Board of Visitors of National Intelligence University, and I'm very pleased to say an AFIO board member. Fran, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thank you, Jim. And for you and for our podcast listeners this afternoon, we have Sheetal Patel to talk with us about counterintelligence and technology challenges for the U.S. Sheetal recently retired from the Central Intelligence Agency after a distinguished career of 28 years. Thank you for your service, Sheetal. Prior to her retirement, she was the Assistant Director for CIA's Transnational and Technology Mission Center, which is dedicated to leveraging emerging technologies for U.S. strategic advantage. She also served as the Assistant Director for CIA's Counterintelligence, which is focused on safeguarding U.S. intelligence personnel, operations, and technology from evolving global issues. Throughout her career, Sheetal has led in a high-impact way on issues that are of mission-critical importance, particularly in areas of Southeast Asia, where she was involved during the War on Terror. So thank you, Sheetal. Welcome very much, and welcome to our viewers today.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you, Jim, for inviting me to this podcast. I'm very excited about it. I have a lot of things to share on CI and tech. So, Fran, I'm going to open it up to you to start firing away questions, as I know you're ready to do.
All right, great, Sheetal. So, Sheetal, what do you see as key vulnerabilities in the U.S. today when it comes to counterintelligence threats?
So, when it comes to the number of CI threats, I think what I would really highlight is the sheer landscape of the threats, right? And they're coming from really things that are a strength. Our open society, vast academic research landscape, the robust private sector. With all of those and a globally linked economy, I think it's just we have a lot more vulnerabilities. I'm not advocating changing society. I think that's what makes us strong. But I think just understanding those vulnerabilities is really important, right? During COVID, we understood the globally linked supply chains, the manufacturing, like understanding where equipment was coming from, where technology is coming from. I think it's just become much more complex. And as you said, I worked Southeast Asia, South Asia. The implications on the global war of terror, they were very clear. Now, I think if you take an area like Africa and you look at telecom, which to me is like one of the best examples of vulnerabilities, a huge chunk of Africa's telecom infrastructure is actually Chinese. It is Huawei and ZTE. And so, why would somebody care about that? Well, you would care about that because when you have the infrastructure, you have the data centers, the e-commerce, you have access to a lot of data. And I think the biggest vulnerability is all this data. Who accesses data? How is data moving? who has control of that information. And I think just understanding that. So in Africa, going back to Africa, okay, it's the telecom system, great. It's the infrastructure, it's internet. But then a third of African ports are Chinese. Then, if you look at processing of critical minerals, a lot of that, the Chinese have got the bulk of those rights in Africa. So it becomes a much more important, but not necessarily something that hits you square in the face on an issue like terrorism. So that's why I think it's vulnerabilities, but it's the complexity about all of it. And it's the fact that the strategic competition, the bottom line is it's occurring in the private sector and the commercial space. So that creates a different vulnerability in terms of how we approach CI threats. I mean, if that makes sense. But that's how I tend to look at it.
So I would like to follow up a little on that.
Sure.
So I definitely understand the issue of complexity. And I say over the last decade or two, that complexity has become so much more difficult to understand. And I think your example is a perfect one because the average American, thinks like Africa is very far away, threats to African telecom. How does it affect me? How does it affect U.S. national security interests? Well, one, I'd be interested in your view on if those technologies are vulnerable in Africa, are we also looking at vulnerabilities inside the U.S. for everything from folks, people's personal identification information in healthcare systems to secrets on, sort of national security technologies, but also just unpack a little bit how much those vulnerabilities in Africa actually directly affect the average U.S. citizen. Because I think that's an easy thing to not fully understand. We're not talking about just walking into a company in the United States and stealing something out of a safe anymore. We are really talking about worming our way in, and those access points can, I think, be anywhere.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely correct. I think the way information flows and the way data moves across the world, including US companies and others, everybody is riding everybody else's infrastructure. And so then your information becomes vulnerable, not necessarily in the United States, but if it is traversing the world based on whatever interaction you are doing. And just understanding that and being able to mitigate it is important because we're not going to be able to reverse everything. I think the same holds true in Latin America, right? That's a southern neighbor, but you have the same kind of CI threats coming from there when it comes to infrastructure, telecom. We rely on encryption a lot. And so some of it we are protected from, but I think it is just an understanding of even financial transactions move across a multitude of networks around the world. And I just don't think people understand how much information moves and how rapidly around the world. Does that help explain that one?
Absolutely. And I think the information as a vulnerability is sort of a key vulnerability. Are there any other areas of vulnerability that you'd like to speak to or ones that might be closer to home?
I think some of it is just the complexity of this, the dual use nature of some of the tech that we are talking about now. The insider threat aspect of it, the cutting edge emerging tech. There's a lot of IP theft, insider threat vulnerabilities that come from having such a broad threat landscape, I guess I would say.
Thank you. That was great. I really appreciate that. And I think it helped a lot of listeners really understand the global connectedness aspect of U.S. vulnerabilities. All right, so let's turn to China. China is most often cited as the top intelligence threat to strategic U.S. national security interests. How do you assess the CI threat from China? And here I'm looking at its approach to intelligence collection, its targets, agent recruitment, whatever you would like to speak to, but very specifically their MO.
So, yeah, if anybody has been tracking China and President Xi Jinping, it's China's stated policy, party policy, President Xi Jinping's policy, to displace the United States as the preeminent world power. And that's not just militarily, but it's also economically. And then the secondary one, which, I think the priorities go back and forth depending on which day of the week it is and what is going on. But the second priority for China is maintaining internal stability. And so when it comes to CI and what it means in terms of espionage and how they approach intelligence operations, it is a whole of government approach. It's basically the equivalent to all hands on deck. So you have the traditional intelligence services recruiting spies, right? We had Jerry Lee, who was arrested. There's been Kevin Mallory, who's been arrested. Those are coming out of government institutions. That's traditional espionage. Then you have state-owned enterprises whose job it is to protect the party, right? And promote party ideology. And that means, what does the party want? Well, the party has prioritized tech spaces. They've prioritized AI. They've prioritized energy, defense manufacturing and its supply chain. They have prioritized energy. So everybody is going to be looking to gain the advantage on that, whether it's through IP theft, joint ventures, illicit procurement, right? So you have that aspect of it. Then you have the academics and researchers. So you have the 1,000 Talents program, which is a program to basically get people to send research back to China and cutting edge research. Then you have the diaspora. So you can use coercion, you can use overseas citizens to basically report on what is of interest to the state. So you have aggressive recruitments. You have aggressive recruitments of insiders in Western firms. You have joint ventures. It makes it a top intelligence threat, right? And it's one that's not going to go away because these are stated priorities. And I'll give you a really good example of how they are codifying all of this. So in the last couple of years, China has passed a bunch of espionage laws. And basically what those laws, in a sense, are doing is saying that the private sector will be aligned with party ideology. Every private sector company will be supported as long as they fall in line with party ideology. Every company will have a Chinese Communist Party cell in its C-suite equivalent, in its leadership. Every ordinary Chinese citizen is supposed to report on suspicious activity. Now, what does it mean for US and international firms? Well, if you operate in China and you have a certain number of local employees, then technically you are also required to have a CCP cell in your C-suite somewhere. And one of the examples that came to mind is Jack Ma of Alibaba. He was one of the shining stars of Chinese not private equity, but just the private sector, right? Doing extremely well. And then he starts lashing out at regulators. He disappeared for a while. And when he came back, he started towing the Chinese government line. And by default, he put in the CCP cell that he had to have. It is now an integrated part of his leadership team. And that's what he was fighting against before he kind of took a sabbatical. And so I think the way they are approaching this, it makes it very difficult to tell what is regular work from what is espionage, corporate espionage, or just standard influence, right? It becomes much more complicated. And that's why I think they are a top intelligence threat.
Well, thank you. And I have a follow-up that perhaps the breadth of your answer already somewhat answers the question, but maybe just put a fine point on it for me. Given what you just said, what are the challenges for U.S. counterintelligence methods in trying to counter the breadth of that activity?
So I think the scope and scale is the biggest challenge, right? If you're doing a whole of state approach, and they're not the only ones that have a whole of state approach. when it comes to counterintelligence and intelligence operations. Russia is also similar to that, and so are other adversaries. And what we have to do is it's not just looking at trusted insiders, but it's also all the data breaches that have occurred, right? Whether from cyber attacks or from hackivists who hack and leak it. But we've had the Office of Personnel Management, United Airlines, Marriott, health data, financial data. When you have a whole of government approach and then you have all this data, a data rich environment to go looking in, you can actually come up with some really good approaches to cleared or vulnerable Americans because you have a lot of data on them, right? It is a targeting officer's dream. And for CI methods, I think the motivations still haven't changed in terms of spying or providing insider trade secrets. It's all money, ideology, coercion, ego. I mean, those, it's incredible, but those have remained the same. Whether you're hacking and leaking it or whether you're, getting money from a foreign service, it is all exactly the same. And I think the other challenge for our methods, and I think this is one that we always have to be mindful of, is complacency. And it's not a nefarious term. I think it's we just get comfortable doing things in certain ways. We get comfortable, like we've always done it this way. We should do it this way. It has worked so far. And I think a little bit of devil's advocacy or maybe changing things up often is actually really good. We do adapt, we do change, but sometimes we are a little slower to adapt than we should. And frankly, I think one of the things that's going to help us in this is having robust insider threat programs. And it can be whatever people want to call it. It can be a risk management program, it can be insider threat, it can be a security program. But I think having public and private sector having a uniform understanding of what such a program should look like, I think would help address that challenge for CI.
Thank you. I have one other China-specific question, and this actually blends, I think, with your expertise on the tech side. With China's goal of dominating critical technologies like artificial intelligence, biotech, quantum computing, what emerging tech sectors, whether in the US or elsewhere, are most vulnerable to Chinese espionage, and what are the implications of what they steal?
Okay, so I would say the vulnerability, I don't know if it's vulnerable to Chinese espionage or already an area where the Chinese have a lot of interest, right? So there's already existing vulnerabilities. But I think it's in a lot of the tech spaces. It's the ones you mentioned, right? AI, biotech. But I think some of the vulnerabilities are the interconnectedness of the technologies. And where I'm talking about vulnerability to Chinese espionage, maybe, or even the Chinese just getting ahead or becoming a near peer, right? Some of that interconnectedness is one where I think we don't focus on too often because we focus on each individual technology. So I'll give you an example of it because this is the way I think about it. Like for AI, you need high performance computing. And for high performance computing, you need not just the cutting edge microchips and semiconductors, but you also need data centers. You need the telecom infrastructure to move the data back and forth. And you need power to run the data centers. And you need a lot of power to run them. So for power, you need batteries. And then who dominates the battery supply chain? It's the Chinese. And then they also have a lock-in on the critical minerals refining and processing that goes into the batteries, as well as a lot of other defense industrial tech. Then for high performance computing, I would say the West is still ahead in software. We're always going to have the advantage in that space. But in semiconductors, the Chinese are building slightly higher end chips. They're not at the point where you have where Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, TSMC, is, or Samsung, but they are getting there. And I think one of the vulnerabilities we might have is probably looking at things where we look at things and we want perfect standards. We have safety standards. We want high yield, right? We want the quality to be really good. But if you are not looking at that and you're just looking at getting something out that works and you're not really concerned about the amount of yield, well, yeah, you can get a 7 nanometer chip out that the Chinese did, and you can put it in a Huawei phone, and then you can sell it overseas, and you get to a market that you wanted to gain influence in. So I think some of those interconnectedness of the technologies. So the other thing on power is nuclear energy. So when I was doing some of the research for our talk today, half the nuclear power reactors that were built in the past decade were built in China, but the West has the design for them. So I think it's really a race on who's going to get there first, not necessarily the vulnerability to espionage, because that's been there. The academic research is going to always be there. We don't want to also, I think when it comes to some of these topics, you can't be so risk averse because it's vulnerable to Chinese espionage, because they're going to get there even if they have to build it themselves, right? They're going to hire the experts and do it. In telecom, what's interesting in what they're doing is they are trying to set the international standards for the next generation of telecom systems. So what we operate under now have largely been Western standards, but they are sending their experts to these international standards boards to set the standards. And so that gives you more access and leverage in the grand scheme of things. In fintech, they're trying to displace the dollar as the currency of choice. They have their own digital currency. I mean, there's so many things that are going on in so many different spaces that I think it's, again, back to the scope of the threat that makes the vulnerabilities high. And then you were talking about theft, right? More of like the implications of it. So if you look at intellectual property theft, I think the estimated numbers are $200 to $600 billion a year of IP theft, whether it's trade secrets, counterfeit goods. And that's not just financial implications. That has huge reputational risk for companies, as well as national security risk, depending on where that IP theft occurred. Like, is it in critical infrastructure? Is it in a defense technology area? And so I think some of these things are things that everybody is aware of. And there hasn't been an administration literally in the last 15 years that is not tracking on these things. But I think it's just a broad and pervasive issue.
Well, thank you, Sheetal. That was a really complete answer. I really appreciate that. I think it was very useful for folks to hear. I'm going to shift away from China, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the threat from Russia, maybe as you see it over the last decade. And if you want to talk about any other adversarial threat, please go ahead. I don't want to limit it to just China and Russia, but I think from a counterintelligence perspective, we sort of put them in a class of their own.
And they still remain in a class of their own. I think Iran is a close second if China and Russia are number one. And I think one of the things, we can talk about Russia, but I think one of the things that complicates and makes things much more difficult for CI is our adversaries work with each other against us. So we can't assume that, just because the Russians know this, we can't assume that the Chinese don't know it or the Iranians don't know it. We now have to assume, just as the world is globally connected, that some of our adversaries are going to be connected and talking amongst themselves, as we would like to say. But when it comes to Russia, where I find them to be particularly effective is probably not the right word, because I don't want to give them credit for anything. But I think they have had a whole of government approach on kind of focused on discrediting democratic institutions. and democratic ideals, and getting people to question the Western democracy model. And it goes back to like protecting themselves, weakening Western institutions. Long, well-known Russian strategy. I think what has happened recently, they haven't changed. I mean, they've amplified how much they do it. But I think with the expansion of so much social media and all these online news services and AI and deep fakes, they can amplify messages and get it to a broader audience and make it a little bit more difficult to counter it. Because people are having a harder time telling what is misinformation. I mean, there are US companies that are coming out and going, no, this is fake or this is fake. But I think that the pace of it is so fast. And with societal fractures and people questioning their own government, it doesn't take much to sow discord. And they, the Russians have been very active in Ukraine as well with their active measures.
Thank you. I want to make sure that we save plenty of time to talk a little bit more about your technology background as well and some other issues. So I'm going to shift this now to a broader question. Can you describe a moment in your career when a CI failure or near failure led to critical insights or changes in practice, where the institution really had to rethink its ways of doing business and think about it, doing it a different way? And obviously, whatever you can say here.
So what I can talk about is in 2013 with Edward Snowden. I think that was a huge shock and a wake-up call. And for the audience, Edward Snowden was a contractor that stole a vast amount of data and put it out there on the internet using, I forgot the magazine. I should have this, but I remember the journalist who I won't mention. But anyway.
I think it was Der Spiegel.
Yes,
maybe?
Thank you. Yes. Because I get him and then Schultz confused a bit. One was Vault 7 WikiLeaks and the other one was Der Spiegel. But when it came to Snowden, I think it was a shock to the entire intelligence community and all of us on how much data one person could access, who was a contractor from where he was sitting, could not only access it, but download it and take it without anybody knowing. And I think that was one of those big issues where we had moved, the intelligence community had moved, we understood how to use data, but we hadn't had the security bells and whistles catch up to the way we were using and transporting data. So we hadn't caught up to the where is our data? Why is it being accessed? Who's accessing it? And do we know if it's being downloaded? And I think those were some of the big changes that came about afterwards, because I was working in CI at the time. And those were things that were being asked. Like, we need to know where our data is. The data is a huge vulnerability. How are we sharing it? And it wasn't to stop sharing information, because that was a big post 9/11 thing, but it was really, how do we do this in a smarter way so we know what's happening? I think the other thing was a personnel security issue. We also weren't looking at the security processing for contractors in the same way we were our staff. And I think the same thing could be said right now if you're looking at public and private sector, just making sure, knowing where the data is, who's accessing the data and how it's being accessed. Banks tend to do a pretty good job with this, actually, because they have a lot of client data. So there's a lot of fiscal risk. But I think that was one of the big wake-up calls for me. That was a huge shocker.
And as a follow-on to that, if you were advising the next generation of CI officers, what's the one mindset or principle that you'd insist they adopt now so that we continue to do the job better?
I think, and I was doing this before I left too, and I think it's not just for CI professionals, but I think for any intelligence officer, it is having a risk acceptance mindset, like understanding the risks you're taking and mitigating as much as possible. Because if we were going to go into zero risk, then it might not be something that an intelligence officer needs to actually do. But I think for CI officers in particular, you need to be very comfortable in the gray space. Don't look for black or white. And gray space is, to me, risk mitigation. And then I would also say, because there is no excuse now for anybody to say, I don't understand technology, right? I think you have got to be conversant in technology if you're doing CI.
Thanks. All right, now I'm going to shift to the technology focus.
Okay.
And, what technological trends do you think the U.S. intelligence community might be either underestimating or overestimating in terms of threat potential?
So I don't think, in terms of threat potential, I think the intelligence community is doing a really good job estimating tech trends, right, across the board. So in my last job, we talked to all IC partners, other government partners, and private sector about tech trends. Everybody kind of understands where they're going. I think if there is any kind of underestimation, it might be in what I would call Western mirror imaging. The same thing that I mentioned earlier, like if we would build it this way, so this is probably the way you would go about doing it. I think that might be an area where there might potentially could be some miscalculation, right? And I think the other area is not a lot of emphasis on the interconnectedness of all these tech spaces. AI is not just a force multiplier for misinformation, but it is also going to be a force multiplier for biotechnology. It's going to be a force multiplier for power. High performance computing directly affects AI. It also affects biotechnology, right? So all these interconnected areas, if we're not looking at them in that way all the time, I think that's a potential where we could be underemphasizing. The other challenge I think that we have is when it comes to tech trends is a little bit of stovepiping, right? There's a lot more communication and back and forth that needs to happen between the public and private sector. A lot more robust communication, sharing of information, what's going on, what are they seeing in terms of trends, what are we seeing. It just makes it much stronger, because now really it is absolutely critical when economic security is national security. In order to understand economic security, we need to understand where we are in that battle space. And as an intelligence community, we don't rate ourselves.
So I guess on the overestimating side, I'd just be interested if you have any thoughts there. I guess in my day in counterintelligence, it was biometrics are going to put us out of business, which they certainly made the world a little more challenging until we adjusted. And I won't say any more about that specifically, but just
Right.
the idea that when you approach a technological change with such kind of a doomsday approach, it kind of paralyzes you. So are there areas in technology, one, where there's real opportunities for the US, and two, could talk at least a little bit about the risk of demonizing some of these technological changes in ways that prevent us from being innovative?
So I think we have gotten beyond the doomsday. You're always going to get some of those doomsday preppers that are like, oh my gosh, AI is going to be the end. All jobs are going to go away. We're not going to be able to operate securely around the world. But I got to tell you, I will bet on our tradecraft any day of the week, right? We are now embracing technology and saying we're going to use the technology to our advantage to operate. And having that mindset, I think, gets us away from this, oh my gosh, biometrics are not going to let us do our business that way. We have to change the tradecraft, right? We have to adapt, and we have to be able to work within the ubiquitous technical surveillance environment we are living in. I don't think it's impossible. I also think, like, if you look at things such as deep fakes or know your customer, there are always ways to identify the deep fakes. There are opportunities to use what we are seeing our adversaries use against us and turn it back on the offensive. Anything that we have to take defense on, I think we can take offense on and do it much better. And I think that's a little bit more of the mindset that's coming in, because, like you said, you get paralysis is no way to operate in a clandestine organization, and we can run the risk of that if we stay tech neutral, I would say.
Thank you. And maybe this question is a bit of a follow-on to that, which is, how have you seen adversarial nations using AI and machine learning in ways that undermine national security and economic supremacy? So beyond just the counterintelligence challenge, is how have you seen those technologies come in ways that have real negative implications for the U.S.?
So I can't give specific examples, but
Sure.
I would say if I were the adversary or any one of the adversaries, AI is a great equalizer, right? Because the models are available, they're open source. You can then put it and exponentially increase your output for whatever you're trying to do. So I would put it on large data sets that I might have collected and didn't quite know what I had in them. But I can use AI models to really figure out what I have and do it without having a human have to go through it, which will not be possible in multiple lifetimes. Then I would put AI on disinformation and use deep fakes. I would also not amplify, but I really improve the sophistication of my cyber attacks. That's an enabler. AI can definitely help enable sophistication in cyber attacks and use it against critical infrastructure. I would also improve my weapons systems, because if I don't have all the engineers and all the expertise I need, I can actually use AI and models to tell me if my systems work the way they're supposed to. And if they don't, how can I make them better? How can I make the accuracy better? So I think there's a lot of things that AI can do that undermines national security and economic security, right? The cyber attacks alone, if you can make them more sophisticated, you're really going to get at more economic data.
So it sounds like you're suggesting that, in this respect, that maybe some of those second and third tier adversarial countries do gain some asymmetric advantage if they are smart about the way they use the technology.
Absolutely.
All right. So I'm back to espionage for one more question, but it's within the technology realm. You can't keep me out of counterintelligence. I'm sorry. What keeps you up at night when you think about the intersection between quantum computing and espionage?
Ooh, okay. So there are two things. I think the first one is quantum computing. There's a race to get to a quantum computer. Now, there's a lot of uses for quantum computing that are going to help science. They're going to revolutionize the world. But from my parochial perspective, I worry that an adversary that develops a quantum computer is going to be able to break the encryption that we have been relying on for years to protect our people, operations, and sources across the world, right? Because there's been a lot of collection of information. The West collects a lot of information. Our adversaries collect a lot of information. And we've all been relying on the encryption to keep it secure. I mean, having a quantum computer and being able to break encryption without a cipher key is going to be a game changer. And hopefully it does not happen before we make everything quantum resistant. So that is a thing that keeps me up at night. Another one that's kind of related goes back to how I said AI could be used on data sets. We have a lot of data, and sometimes we don't know what is in our data. So if you were asking me, what do I think we're missing? I think we might be missing trends and advances in the tech space because it's stuck in data that we have not looked through yet. And that's not just us, that's the West at large, right? Everybody collects a lot of data. Data is like the key right now, but you got to be able to go through it. So those would be the two things that keep me up at night.
Well, that would be enough to keep, I think, most of us up at night for sure. You spoke earlier about deep fake technology, and so I'd kind of like to come back to that a little bit, if you don't mind. Can you speak to any examples of how deep fake technology has already impacted or could soon impact intelligence or counterintelligence operations? So we all know about it on our social media, but sort of, in the hard realm of intelligence work, how could it come into play?
So if you look at the deep fakes and you look at how information is portrayed, and if they get much better, right? And it's harder to detect what is a deep fake. Right now, adversaries are using it. The implications in intelligence operations, I think it becomes the way we look at our reality is we put credence on information based on the credibility of the source it is coming from, right? So the person or the organization. If deep fakes and misinformation hurts the credibility of that source, then you start to question everything. And so you have people right now that are questioning things that have occurred. Like there's no debate. 9/11, the Holocaust, right? They're questioning it based on their distrust of the information sources they're getting it from. And you can find anything you want out there to believe. So if you take that down a couple of roads, right, you might not be able to believe signals intelligence you collect because you don't know where it's coming from. You can manipulate data. You can do a lot of things with information that makes it very hard to weigh that information, right, and come up with the correct analysis. I mean, in 2022, I think there was a deep fake that was released. It was released off of social media site that had President Zelensky telling his Ukrainian troops to surrender to the Russian forces. It got bounced from a social media site to a hacked Ukrainian website, and it started getting played everywhere. And so there was a lot of confusion among the Ukrainian ranks, and he had to quickly get out there and say that was fake news. But you could literally see how, if you keep going, you could have implications in intelligence operations, intelligence analysis, just information we see on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of frightening. And I think some of the opportunities that are out there there are opportunities in this, right? There's DARPA's doing a whole program with the University of Denver to get people to make really good deep fakes and then work with Menlo Park to find ways to identify those deep fakes. Something outside the intelligence community completely, but it is one that I've been tracking, is countries that have had a lot of experience dealing with Russian misinformation, like Finland, Sweden, Denmark, all these countries. They have media literacy classes that they teach their children. And they teach them to identify propaganda, misinformation. And currently, Taiwan and Ukraine are looking at teaching this to their children. Ours is spotty in the United States, but it is something that I think would help across the board in intelligence operations, but as well as society at large, right? If children are taught how to weigh information. Anyway, that was my sidebar on that because I was researching it.
No, actually, that was great. And, I just traditionally, if you think about the issue of deception, and, it takes concerted effort for an entity to get out a stream of information in ways that it knows that will be heard and interpreted incorrectly. And I mean, disinformation was a year-long process for, adversaries in the past. And in the deep fake, sort of society, you can have a deception campaign maybe in a much, much shorter period of time. And so for the analyst trying to understand what's taking place, or the operators in the collection mode, and how do you figure out what's real and what's not, it sort of makes me glad that I'm on this end of my career, because I think that would have been an incredibly challenging thing to do. So thank you for, giving us such a sort of insightful answer on that one. All right. So here's one of my breadbasket type questions. What's the one question no one ever asks you and should about the future of counterintelligence and or emerging technologies and technology transfer? And in addition to what's the question that they should ask, and of course, I'd like you to answer it as well, are there opportunities we may be missing because people don't think to ask that question?
So I'll address the second one first. I don't think there are opportunities we're missing because somebody's not asking me the question. I just hope that what I say, and I'm incredibly passionate about, gains traction. And people are saying it in multiple different ways. So in a narrow way, what I would say nobody really asks me is, are we organized appropriately to deal with the CI threats that are coming, especially in the tech landscape, and working with sophisticated adversaries? And my answer would be no. And that goes for public and private sector. I am a very big believer that while everybody worries about morale for insider threat programs, you can change the name of an insider threat program to risk management, but you have to have one. And it is not a cybersecurity program. So you need to have a cybersecurity program. So your CISO, your IT person, your data person, they all are very important, but as are your human resources person, your security person, and your risk management or insider threat or CI officer. That grouping of people are so critical in ensuring that you have a very strong and robust program. And I think those two things get separated, right? CI comes in, but it's like, oh yeah, you're coming in to do this part. And then HR and security come in to do this side. And even in the private sector, it's not an integrated decision-making or like a board. I think there needs to be a revolution in how we organize to address threats. And it needs to be a little broader than physical security or personnel security. And in my experience, a lot of personnel security issues become very big CI issues if left unattended. And so to me, I think there's an organizational change or a revolution that needs to occur, and there needs to be the same lexicon that the public and private sector are using when it comes to counterintelligence and threats. So nobody asked me that, but I do say it a lot.
All right. Thank you on that. And now I'm to my final question, which is there anything else that you would like to tell the audience today?
I would like to say that while I can talk about threats and CI threats and how scary the world is, I am still an optimist when it comes to the West and an optimist on the United States, because we do have the best of the best. And I think we need to keep having the best people join government, having the best work in the private sector. I don't want to be the one that when it comes to dual use tech, we don't want to be the ones that stop the curing of cancer, right? You just want to stop the genetic advances to create super soldiers from happening. It's that kind of stuff that I think is squishy, but it shouldn't be that scary. I think these are all risks that can be mitigated while still continuing to advance. But then I am an optimist for a CI professional.
Thank you so much, Sheetal. This has really been great.
It's been a lot of fun.
Fascinating conversation. It was a real pleasure to be able to listen into two very well-informed and intelligent ladies talk about some very critical issues. I want to thank both Fran Moore and Sheetal Patel for a very interesting but also educational presentation.
Thank you, Jim, for the invitation.
Thank you, Jim.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.